May 1st, 1960. The skies above Sverdlovsk. A Soviet S-75 Dvina missile battery, tracking a target. A flash of light, a plume of smoke. High above, Francis Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane, an aircraft believed to be untouchable, disintegrates. To the men in the PVO, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, this is more than a victory, it is a vindication. It is proof that the technical arrogance of the West can be shattered by the industrial and ideological might of the Soviet Union. Their borders are secure. Their impenetrable wall of radar and missiles is not a myth, it is a steel, fire-breathing reality. The sky belongs to the Rodina. This confidence defined the 1960s for the PVO. They were the shield of the revolution, a force sprawling across 12 time zones. They operated the largest, densest, and most expensive air defense network ever constructed. From the frozen ice of the Kola Peninsula to the deserts of Turkmenistan, thousands of radars, Tall King, Fan Song, Spoon Rest, were linked, overlapping. They guarded the secret cities, the missile silos, the bomber bases. Thousands of interceptors and tens of thousands of surface-to-air missiles were aimed at the sky, a forest of steel waiting for the American storm. Their entire doctrine was built on a simple, immutable law of physics: endurance. A plane, they reasoned, is a machine. A machine needs fuel. They calculated the ranges of the American B-52 seconds, their B-47 seconds, their new B-58 Hustlers. They knew where the American bases were. They knew how long these aircraft could stay airborne. Their strategy was one of defense in depth, designed to bleed the American bomber streams dry, to force them to turn back or be shot down long before they reached Moscow or the industrial heart of the Urals. The U-2's destruction had proven that even altitude was no defense. The PVO was confident. They were prepared. They were, they believed, winning. Then, the Phantom appeared. The date is July 29th, 1967. A PVO command bunker near Severomorsk, the heavily fortified home of the Soviet Northern Fleet. The air is thick with the metallic tang of ozone from the radar consoles and the low, constant hum of vacuum tubes. A senior lieutenant, his eyes raw from a 12-hour shift, leans forward. A new contact. It isn't a B-52. It's not a flight of F-4 Phantoms. It's a single, tiny blip, moving at a speed that cannot be real. The analog computers processing the radar data are struggling to keep up. The plotters mark the track. It is moving at over 3,000 kilometers per hour. It is flying at an altitude they previously thought impossible for an air-breathing engine, over 25 kilometers high, on the very edge of space. This is not a target, it is a ghost. Before a missile battery can even be brought to a full hot status, the blip has streaked across the sky, directly over their most sensitive naval installations, over the submarine pens and the missile bunkers. It photographs everything. And then, as quickly as it appeared, it accelerates and vanishes over the Barents Sea. The bunker is silent. The air defense commander gets on the line to Moscow, his report sounding like madness. The operators stare at the empty screen. They had calculated the physics. For an aircraft to reach that speed and altitude, it would need to burn fuel at an impossible rate. To have come from a known American base in the United Kingdom or Norway, flown this mission, and returned. It would have required a fuel tank the size of a building. It was a physical, logistical impossibility. Yet, the Phantom was real. The PVO's impenetrable wall had not just been breached, it had been mocked. If you want to understand the true impact of these Cold War pressure games, subscribe to Cold War Impact. What the Soviets were tracking was not, by itself, the true weapon. They were tracking the SR-71 Blackbird, an aircraft that represented a quantum leap in technology. But the SR-71 was only the tip of the spear. The thing that made it truly terrifying, the thing that shattered Soviet defense doctrine, was its unseen partner. To understand the solution, you must first understand the American problem. The loss of Gary Powers' U-2 1960 was a profound shock to the CIA and the White House. Their invulnerable eye in the sky was gone. President Eisenhower had been caught in a blatant lie. The need for a new reconnaissance platform, one that could not be touched, was paramount. The answer came from the shadows of Burbank, California, from Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works and the mind of Clarence Kelly Johnson. The project was called Oxcart. The result was the A-12 and its more famous successor, the SR-71. It was not a normal airplane. It was a titanium monster, built to live in the near-space environment above 80,000 feet, where the sky turns black and the curvature of the Earth is visible. Its two massive Pratt & Whitney J58 engines were a revolutionary hybrid, acting as turbines at low speeds and transforming into high-efficiency ramjets at altitude. But this revolutionary technology came with a list of terrifying problems. The titanium skin, necessary to survive the 600-degree Fahrenheit temperatures of Mach 3 flight, was notoriously difficult to work with. The fuel tanks, also made of titanium, would not seal properly. They could not seal by design. The airframe had to be built loose. On the ground, the SR-71 sat in a pool of its own, specialized JP-7 fuel. Only when the plane accelerated to speed, the airframe heating and expanding by several inches, would the tanks seal themselves. This meant the SR-71 had to take off with only a partial fuel load, just enough to get airborne and climb. Its range, on its own, was operationally useless. It was a tethered beast. It could fly at Mach 3, but it couldn't get to the fight. This is where the real Phantom enters the story. It wasn't sleek or black or fast. It was a modified Boeing 707 airliner, a plane the Soviets knew well. But this one was different. It was the KC-135Q Stratotanker. The Q designation was critical. It meant this tanker was specially modified to carry the SR-70, one's bizarre high-flash point JP-7 fuel. Standard tankers couldn't touch it. The KC-135Q was the Blackbird's lifeline. This was the American solution. It wasn't just a faster plane. It was a system. An SR-71 would launch from Beale Air Force Base in California or Kadena in Okinawa, leaking and light on fuel. Minutes later, climbing through 25,000 feet, it would meet its mother, the KC-135Q. Lying on his stomach in the tanker's tail, a boomer operator would fly the fueling boom into a tiny receptacle on the SR-70, one's back, pumping thousands of gallons of specialized fuel into the Blackbird. Now the SR-71 was full. Now its engines were hot. Now the pilot could push the throttles forward and accelerate into the stratosphere, leaving the tanker far behind. The flying gas station was the key. It was the invisible logistical chain that turned a short-range marvel into a global strategic weapon. It meant the SR-71 could launch from anywhere, refuel over the Atlantic, streak across the Kola Peninsula, refuel again over the North Sea, and return home. The Soviets in the Severomorsk bunker were staring at their maps, trying to calculate range and fuel, but they were using the wrong equation. They were trying to stop a single, mythical plane. They had no idea they were fighting a floating, airborne logistics network. Their impenetrable wall was designed to stop a fist. The Americans had invented a ghost. Back in the command bunker at Severomorsk, the silence has turned sour. The phantom blip, the one that moved at impossible speeds, is gone. But the political fallout is just beginning. The phone lines to Moscow are crackling with disbelief, then anger. It is a computer malfunction, one general declares, a solar flare, atmospheric clutter. A malfunction does not fly a perfect reconnaissance track over the Northern Fleet's primary submarine pens, the Severomorsk commander retorts, his voice tight. It was real. The report goes all the way to the Politburo. It is a technical impossibility, but it is also a political crisis. The PVO, the pride of the Union, the victors of Sverdlovsk, have been exposed. Their most sensitive bastion of nuclear power has been overflown, and they were powerless to stop it. An order is issued, echoing across the vast network of the Soviet air defense. Whatever this is, it will be destroyed. The PVO digs in. They are not a defeated force. They are a wounded, proud animal. They recalibrate their radars. They analyze the flight path, the altitude, the speed. They calculate the only possible intercept vectors. They strip their fastest interceptors, the Sukhoi Su-15 Flagon, for high-altitude performance, removing non-essential equipment. They move batteries of their new high-altitude S-200 Gammon missiles to key corridors. They create ambush zones. They know the Americans will be back. The Americans are arrogant. They always come back. They are correct. The date is October 10th, 1967. The target, the heavily defended city of Vladivostok, home of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. Deep within a PVO command center on the Kamchatka Peninsula, a radar operator sees it first. He doesn't even recognize it as a target. Not immediately. It looks like high-altitude static, a faint electronic whisper at the extreme edge of his screen. But it's moving. And it's moving. At Mach 3. Contact. Bearing 090. Altitude. Estimated 26 kilometers. Speed 3200. The room freezes. This is not a drill. The air defense commander barks. Scramble. Scramble all alert fighters. Vector 090. Angels 85. At airfields across the Kamchatka, MiG-21 Fishbed and Su-15 Flagon, interceptors are blasted with ignition. Pilots, already suited up, sprint to their jets. They don't even wait for the towers. One after another, they light their afterburners, climbing in a near-vertical, desperate ascent, their engines gulping fuel at a colossal rate. In the bunker, the track of the SR-71, known to its pilots as the Habu, is a clean, precise line drawn across the tactical display. The tracks of the interceptors are frantic, clawing lines falling desperately behind. MiG-201, a strained voice crackles over the radio. I have no tone, he is too high. He is just too high. The MiG-21 was a phenomenal interceptor, a sports car of a jet, but it was designed to fight bombers at 40,000 feet, perhaps 50,000 inches, a ballistic zoom climb. It was not designed for this. At 70,000 feet, the air is too thin to provide lift for its small delta-shaped wings. Its engine sputters, starved of oxygen. The pilot is no longer flying. He is a passenger in a falling piece of metal. His controls turn to useless mush. He's stalling out, the controller screams in the bunker. MiG-201, eject, eject! Another pilot, this one in the heavier, more powerful Su-15, pushes his aircraft past every red line. Warning lights flash across his cockpit. The engines whine in protest. He manages to get a partial radar lock, a maybe. He fires 2 R-40 missiles in a desperate, hopeful volley. The missiles scream off the rails, accelerating to Mach 4. On the ground, the operators cheer, but the cheer dies in their throats. The missiles are climbing, but they are climbing into thinner and thinner air. Their small control surfaces become ineffective. They are fighting gravity and atmospheric physics. The SR-71, meanwhile, is not even in the same plane of existence. It is not climbing, it is in a steady, level cruise, its ramjet engines breathing the thin air, operating at their peak efficiency. The missiles, their fuel exhausted, fail to reach the target's altitude. They arc over, impotent, and begin their long, dark fall back to Earth. In the bunker, the operators watch the blip. It hasn't even altered its course. It hasn't jinked, it hasn't dived, it hasn't deployed countermeasures. It simply continues. It sails directly over the primary submarine bases of the Pacific Fleet, its cameras and side-looking radar absorbing every secret, every piece of hardware, every new construction. The line of interceptor plots on the screen has fallen away, a desperate, failed swarm. The SR-71's track is a clean, unwavering line of surgical precision. It finishes its run, and then, as if to add a final, crushing insult, it accelerates, leaving them behind. The pursuit was a failure, it was a humiliation. Miles away, floating over the dark, frigid waters of the Sea of Okhotsk, a different kind of scene is unfolding. It is calm. Inside the cockpit of a KC-135Q stratotanker, the pilot sips lukewarm coffee from a thermos. His co-pilot is reading a magazine. They are flying in a slow, lazy racetrack pattern. A precisely defined box of empty sky, waiting. They are the gas station. In the SR-71, 90,000 feet above the Earth, pilot Robert Helt and reconnaissance systems officer, RSO, Larry Elliott, are finished with their take. The mission over Vladivostok is complete. Okay, Larry. Helt's voice crackles over the intercom. Let's go home. Roger that. Descending for the tanker. The Blackbird begins a long, gentle descent. On their screens, they can see the swarm of failed intercepts, the blips of the MiGs falling back to their bases, low on fuel, and Elliott notes them in his log. The PVO had thrown everything they had at them. It wasn't enough. They descend to 25,000 feet, slowing to a mere 350 knots. They are now, for a brief window, vulnerable. They are flying at the same speed and altitude as a normal airliner. But the Americans are not worried. They are in international waters, protected by a screen of F-4 Phantoms from carriers in the Pacific. Helt expertly guides the nose of the Blackbird. a delicate $2 billion machine toward the massive flying tanker. In the tail of the KC-135Q, the boomer operator, lying on his chest, guides the fuel boom. "Habu, I have you. Clear for contact." With a gentle thunk, the boom locks into the Blackbird's receptacle. Thousands of gallons of JP-7 fuel begin to pour into the SR-71. This is the American perspective. It is not a frantic, desperate chase. It is a logistical, methodical, and calm procedure. It is a system. It is a floating, airborne gas station, enabling a Mach 3 Phantom to appear anywhere in the world, at any time, and then return to its mother to drink, before vanishing again. For the Soviets, this realization is the true moment of shock. The first overflight was a mystery. This second one, this failed, chaotic intercept, is a psychological wound. It is one thing to be beaten by a superior machine. It is another to be mocked by one. The SR-71 did not have to fight. It did not have to dogfight. It did not have to dodge missiles. The pilots of the PVO, men who had trained their entire lives for this aerial duel, were reduced to the level of spectators. They were children throwing stones at a god. The message was clear. This was not an act of war. It was an act of contempt. The Americans were not just gathering intelligence. They were demonstrating that the Soviet Union's borders, their impenetrable wall, the very concept of their sovereign airspace, was a polite fiction. It was a joke. The Americans, they now understood, could fly anywhere they wanted. They could photograph the Politburo's Duckers. They could count the missiles in the silos. They could observe the fleets in their secret harbors. And there was not a single thing the Soviet Union could do to stop them. The Phantom was not just a plane. It was a proclamation of American dominance, written in fire at 90,000 feet. The humiliation at Vladivostok and the mockery over Severomorsk were not isolated incidents. They were the beginning. The shock of the impossible Phantom, the ghost on the radar, quickly curdled into a grim, corrosive, and permanent reality. The Americans had not just built a stunt plane, they had deployed a system. In the PVO command bunkers, the tactical maps began to tell a horrifying story. The ghost blips were no longer random. They were appearing in patterns. They were becoming routine. A new kind of mission profile became infamous in Soviet intelligence circles. It was known to the Americans as the Baltic Express. To the PVO commanders in the Leningrad military district, it was a weekly nightmare. It would begin with a sighting from a radar station near Kaliningrad. A single SR-71 launching from its base at RAF Mildenhall in the United Kingdom would first fly west, out over the Atlantic. There, invisible to Soviet radar, it would meet the first flying gas station, a KC-135Q tanker. It would drink its fill, a full combat load of JP-7 fuel. Then, it would turn east. The SR-71 would accelerate, climbing to 80,000 feet and scream down the gutter of the Baltic Sea, a narrow, congested corridor of international airspace bordered by Sweden, Poland, and the Soviet Baltic republics. A PVO commander in Riga, Latvia, would watch it appear. "Contact! Bearing 280! Speed! Mach 3! He would scramble his best interceptors, these Su-15 seconds. But what was the point? The SR-71 wasn't even in his airspace. It was flying a perfectly legal track. But from its altitude, its powerful, side-looking airborne radar, SLAR, and its technical objective camera could peer sideways, deep into the Soviet Union. It was a standoff reconnaissance mission, but it was moving at 2,000 miles per hour. It would photograph the naval yards in Leningrad, the missile sites in Estonia, the submarine activity in Kaliningrad, all without ever crossing the border. The Soviet interceptors, their afterburners glowing, would claw for altitude, but they were already too late. By the time they reached 40,000 feet, the SR-71 was 100 miles further down the corridor. But here was the true, systemic insult. As the SR-71's track neared the end of the Baltic, it would begin a long, sweeping turn north over Finland. The PVO operators tracking it would see it head back out over the Norwegian Sea. And what would they see waiting for it? Another blip. A slow, fat, civilian-looking blip. Another KC-135Q. The flying gas station would be patiently orbiting, a pre-planned anchor point in the sky. The SR-71, its mission complete, would descend, slow down, and hook up to its mother. The PVO commander in Riga or Leningrad would have to sit and watch, on his own radar screen, as the American Phantom calmly refueled, just outside his missile range before turning for home. This was the system. The SR-71 was the weapon, but the KC-135Q was the strategy. The flying gas stations were the logistical chain that made the entire Soviet border useless. They were floating, mobile air bases. They allowed the Americans to launch from the UK, refuel, perform a high-speed continent-spanning reconnaissance run, refuel again in a completely different sector, and return, all as a routine, day-in, day-out operation. The same story played out across the globe. Over the Kola Peninsula, the PVO commanders stopped treating the Habu as an emergency. It became a scheduled event. They could almost set their watches by it. They would track the SR-71 coming up from the UK. They would see it meet its KC-135Q over the Norwegian Sea, a predictable, infuriating rendezvous. The tanker, the flying gas station, would orbit in its box, a blatant, obvious message: "We are here. We are fueling the ghost that you cannot touch." Then the SR-71 would detach, accelerate, and perform its run. It would streak over Murmansk, over Severomorsk, over the secret nuclear submarine pens. The Soviets would fire their S-200 Gammon missiles. Dozens of them. They would see the smoke trails of their own multi-million ruble interceptors failing to even get close. And then the SR-71 would return to the same tanker, which was still orbiting, waiting. It would top off its fuel and fly home to England. This was the new reality. The Soviet Union, a continent-spanning superpower, had been reduced to a passive, helpless spectator. Its most sensitive military secrets were being photographed on a regular basis, and the operations were being supported, in plain sight, by a fleet of modified airliners. The true symbol of American dominance was not, in the end, the sleek black profile of the SR-71. That was a symbol of terror. A fast-moving, untouchable ghost. No, the true haunting element, the one that broke the morale of the PVO High Command, was the slow, circling blip of the KC-135Q. It was the flying gas station. A Soviet general would stand in his command bunker, staring at the map. He would see the SR-71's track, a defiant line drawn across his motherland, but his eyes would be drawn magnetically to the anchor point. The tanker? Orbiting over the Sea of Japan, orbiting over the North Sea, orbiting over the Mediterranean. That tanker was the visible, tangible proof of his failure. It represented a global, logistical and technological mastery that the Soviet Union could not, in its wildest dreams, replicate. The Soviet system was built on brute force, on massive numbers, on defending a static wall. The Americans had built a system of flow, of flexibility, of global reach. The tanker was the X on the map that marked the spot of their humiliation. It was the gas station that fueled the Phantom. It was the anchor that held the airborne chain. And it proved, day after day, that the Soviet Union's vast, continent-spanning geography, which had defeated Napoleon and Hitler, was now irrelevant. America had simply erased their borders by building a gas station in the sky, just on the other side of the fence. The Kremlin was built on secrets. It ran on whispers, paranoia, and the brutal reality of power. The routine, contemptuous overflights by the SR-71, enabled by its flying gas stations, were no longer just a military problem for the PVO. They were a profound ideological and political crisis. In the 1970s, General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev and the Politburo were not just hearing reports of failed intercepts, they were seeing the implications. This American system, this phantom plane tethered to a floating gas station, proved that the entire Soviet air defense network, the most expensive and sprawling shield ever built, was a complete, humiliating, and catastrophic failure. It was a failure of their technology. It was a failure of their 5-year plans. It was a failure of their command economy. The Americans were not just taking pictures of submarines. They were proving on a weekly basis that the Soviet Union was a Potemkin superpower. It was a hollow giant, a colossus with a porous, undefended border. This could not stand. The shame was too great. An order was given, born of pure, distilled political desperation. It bypassed normal development channels. It was an all-hands blank check decree from the highest levels of the Soviet state. The order was simple. Build a machine that can kill this phantom. Do it now. Spare no expense. This order was not a request for innovation. It was a demand for a brute force solution. And the Soviet industrial base responded in the only way it knew how, with brute force. The result was the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-25, codenamed Foxbat by NATO. When Western intelligence first saw grainy satellite photos of the MiG-25, they were terrified. It was an aeronautical monster. The wingspan was enormous. The twin engine nozzles were the size of small cars. It appeared to be a super fighter, an agile, high-performance machine that could outfly and outfight anything the West had. But the MiG-25 was not a fighter. It was a lie, born of a desperate truth. It was not agile. It was a flying brick. It was not made of exotic titanium like the SR-71. The Soviets could not machine titanium on that scale. Instead, it was welded together from heavy crude nickel steel. Its two Tumansky R-15 engines were not sophisticated, efficient turbines. They were, in fact, simplified, upscaled engines designed for a high-altitude cruise missile. They were monstrously, apocalyptically powerful, and they were also disastrously, suicidally inefficient. The MiG-25 was not a plane. It was a piloted missile. It was designed to do one thing and one thing only: take off, point its nose at the sky, and go up in a straight line as fast as possible to shoot down a high-altitude American bomber. A bomber that, by that point, had already been cancelled. But now, it was the only thing they had that could even attempt to reach the SR-71's altitude. So, the PVO changed its tactics. They deployed the MiG-25 to their most sensitive corridors. The pilots were the best in the Soviet Air Force. Their mission was one of pure, desperate hope. And here, in the cold, technical reality, is why it was always, from the very beginning, a complete failure. The flying gas station, the KC-135Q, had already doomed the Foxbat to irrelevance before it ever left the ground. The SR-71's mission was one of endurance and sustained speed. Aided by its tanker, it could enter the battle space at its leisure, already at altitude, already moving at Mach 3. The MiG-25 was a point defense interceptor. It had, by design, an appallingly short range. Its R-15 engines, gulping fuel at a rate that would drain a normal fighter's tanks in minutes, gave it almost no loiter time. It couldn't patrol, it could only be scrambled. And scramble was a race it could never win. A PVO radar operator would detect the SR-71, already at Mach 3. The alert would sound. The MiG-25 pilot would sprint to his jet. He would ignite the engines, a controlled explosion. He would take off, his afterburners tearing a hole in the sky. But the SR-71 was already 100 miles inside his territory. The MiG-25 pilot would climb. He would push his throttles to the emergency gate past all the red lines. The plane would shudder as it broke Mach 2.5. The steel airframe would glow. In the cockpit, the pilot would be fighting to control a machine that was actively trying to kill him. If he pushed it to Mach 2.8, his engines would begin to overheat, threatening to melt their turbine blades into slag. If he held it there for more than a few minutes, the engines would be permanently destroyed. They were one-way engines. The SR-71, by contrast, was not dashing to Mach 3. It was cruising at Mach 3.2. Its J-58 ramjet engines were more efficient at that speed. The heat that was destroying the MiG was the very thing the SR-71 was designed to live in. The MiG-25 pilot, in his steel cockpit, was in a suicidal sprint, burning his aircraft to pieces, just to try to get a missile lock on a target that was still accelerating away from him. He was a man in a horse-drawn carriage, chasing a bullet train. The entire multi-billion ruble MiG-25 program, the Soviet Union's big bet, was a flawed concept from inception. It was a brute force answer to a question that required finesse. The Americans had created a system of global reach, logistics, and sustained performance, the SR-71 and its KC-135Q flying gas stations. The Soviets had built a steel dragster with wings and no gas tank. This failure is not a matter of debate. It is written in the historical record, in a single brutal statistic. Throughout the entire operational career of the SR-71 Blackbird, from its first missions in the 1960s to its retirement, it flew thousands of sorties over the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. It was tracked by tens of thousands of radars. It was hunted by the MiG-25. It was hunted by the Su-15. Over 4,000 surface-to-air missiles were fired at it. Not a single SR-71 was ever shot down. Not one. Not by a MiG, not by a missile, not by anything. The psychological toll of this reality was corrosive. The PVO pilots, the best of the best, were sent up in their superweapon time and time again. And time again they would return to base, their fuel tanks empty, their engines burnt, their missile radars showing nothing but empty sky. They were heroes of the Soviet Union, but they knew the truth. They knew their big bet was a failure. They knew the sky did not belong to them. It belonged to the Phantom, and to the invisible flying gas station that gave it life. The MiG-25 Foxbat was more than just a failed interceptor. It was a perfect, screaming, steel-welded metaphor for the entire Soviet system. And its failure was not a simple technical one. It was a deep, systemic, and ideological rot. The Americans, faced with the U-2 crisis, had innovated. They had asked a different question. They didn't just ask, how do we fly higher? They asked, how do we create a system of global, untouchable reach? The answer was a network, a logistical masterpiece. It was the SR-71, a titanium marvel. It was the specialized JP-7 fuel. It was the boomer operators. And most critically, it was the KC-135Q flying gas station. It was a system of freedom, flexibility, and technological integration. It was born from the garages of the Skunk Works, from a culture that empowered an engineer like Kelly Johnson to break the rules and invent the future. The Soviet Union, faced with the Habu crisis, had imitated, and it had imitated poorly. The Politburo issued a decree. The command economy lurched into motion. It responded with brute force, with raw, unrefined power. It threw tons of steel, massive, inefficient engines, and the lives of its best pilots at a problem that brute force could not solve. The MiG-25 was the result. It was an attempt to copy the idea of speed without understanding the philosophy of reach. It was an industrial-age sledgehammer trying to swat a digital-age fly. The flying gas station is the key to this entire story. The Soviets also had aerial tankers. They had the Tupolev Tu-16 Badger, but they didn't have a system. Their tankers were tactical. They were designed to give their Badger bombers a little extra range to go and die in a one-way nuclear exchange. They did not have a global, logistical network. They didn't have the web of overseas bases, the culture of high stakes, high-skill boomer crews, or the advanced, flexible command and control necessary to keep a floating gas station orbiting for hours in a precise anchor point over the Sea of Japan, just waiting for a single $2 billion asset to return. The American system was a symphony. The Soviet system was a banging drum. This specific, technical failure, the inability to stop a reconnaissance plane, had a massive, cascading, strategic consequence. It meant that for the last 2 decades of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was operating in the dark, while the United States was operating in broad daylight. The Americans knew everything. They knew where the new Typhoon-class submarines were being built. They knew the readiness of the Northern Fleet. They knew, bolt for bolt, the construction of new ICBM silos. They knew the readiness of the tank armies in East Germany. This information, gathered by the SR-71 and its invisible, tanker-enabled lifeline, allowed American presidents to negotiate from a position of absolute, unshakable strength. When the Soviets bluffed at the SALT II treaty talks, the Americans could see the cards in their hand. When Brezhnev claimed industrial parity, the SR-71's photographs of rusting factories told a different story. The flying gas stations didn't just refuel a spy plane. They fueled the confidence of the entire American political and military establishment. They provided the truth, and that truth was a weapon more powerful than any nuclear warhead. The Soviet command economy, meanwhile, was being bled dry. It was forced to spend billions of rubles it did not have, building thousands of missiles that didn't work, and hundreds of interceptors that couldn't fly high enough to stop a threat that was fundamentally unstoppable. The MiG-25 program was a black hole of resources. The S-200 missile network was a colossal, useless fence. This is how a superpower collapses. Not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing, economic hemorrhage, a death by 1,000 industrial failures. The Soviet Union was trying to compete in a global, high-tech marathon, while its own system forced it to run with ankles chained in steel. The ultimate demonstration of this failure did not happen at 80,000 feet. It happened on the ground, in the streets of Berlin. November 9th, 1989. The Berlin Wall. For decades, this was the ultimate symbol of Soviet brute force. A physical, concrete, impenetrable wall. It was the PVO's doctrine, made of rebar and guard towers. It was the MiG-25, built from concrete. It was the Soviet system's answer to a problem. If people try to leave, build a wall. If a plane flies too high, build a bigger engine. On this night, the wall cracked, not because of a tank assault, not because of a bomber, but because the idea behind it, the command economy, the brute force philosophy, was bankrupt. It had failed. It could no longer pay its bills. It could no longer feed its people. It could no longer pretend to be a superpower. The East German Guards, the elite border troops of this impenetrable fortress, stood aside. They opened the gates. They were like the PVO pilots in their MiG 25 seconds, sitting on the tarmac, watching the SR-71 accelerate away. They knew the game was over. They had nothing left. The wall came down. And 2 years later, the entire Soviet Union, the impenetrable fortress that spanned 12 time zones, simply dissolved. It evaporated. Its borders, which it had spent half a century and trillions of rubles to defend, vanished. In the end, the Cold War was not won by the side with the most tanks, the most missiles, or the most concrete. It was won by the side with the most ideas. The Soviet Union built a system to control its people. The United States built a system to unleash its people. This story, the story of the Phantom and the flying gas station, is the perfect, terrifying, and beautiful illustration of that truth. The Soviets looked at the sky and saw a border to be defended. They built a wall. The Americans looked at the sky and saw a highway. They built a flying gas station. The SR-71, the Habu, now sits in museums, a relic of a bygone era. The KC-135 tankers, remarkably, still fly, modified and upgraded, a testament to their enduring, brilliant design. But the legacy of their partnership is not in the metal. It is in the world we inhabit today. They were the invisible system, the logistical chain of freedom that proved in the silent, cold altitudes of near space that no wall is impenetrable, that no border is absolute, and that in the long race of history, brute force will always be defeated by innovation.